You're listening to the Intrepid Radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Friday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid Radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over, see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. At the same time, you can watch the video simulcast of this show over on my YouTube channel. And that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And while there, you can listen to, join in on the live chat room that's going on right now during the playing of this show. And so meet all the other Intrep heads over there and have a good time talking it up. Tonight, we're going to just kind of jump right into it here. We've been talking about dreams. Not so much dream interpretation as dream understanding. That whole thing about the why do we dream the way we do? Why do we dream? And now we've been looking starting yesterday at the spiritual side or the mystical side of dreaming. We're going to get right back into that, but first I want to read something to you. And this is something that I have read before, I think about a year ago, or almost a year ago on this program. Might have been before the program started officially with Odyssey. And I wanted to read for you the opening of my book that I'm working on, The 10 Breaths of Ra. And this is a book that is going to be a fictional book. Some of you may remember that I read this once before, but I think since it's Friday, and we probably won't even get near to wrapping up this topic on the mystical side of dreaming tonight, I would give you what I hope is a little treat for you, and that is reading the opening of the new book. And I'm well into this book. My agent is really pushing to have me try to get this finished. And it was meant originally to be a book that is written to young adults. So think of your Harry Potter, Twilight, Rick Riordan's books, all of those books that cater to kids from really about 12, 13 years old up into college age is considered young adult. But it definitely has adult themes in it. It's not going to be like your Robert Ludlum novel or Leon Uris or anything like that, but it's going to be, I think, an exciting novel. It's set in the 1920s in Egypt, and it is involving two main characters. One is a character named Dano, yes, D-A-N-O, Dano Badcock, and he is a British Romani. Now, Romani, the Gypsies. Little bit of the backstory is that his grandfather and grandmother were roving gypsies in Great Britain in the wagons, the horse-drawn wagons, and his father made a killing by getting into aeroplanes, and made a killing during World War I. They bought an old estate, 1,000-year-old castle, and this is now the family Badcock Manor. And this is where this kid grows up. He's in his early 20s, adventurer, explorer, pretty much has unlimited funds available to him. That kind of a kid. He's not spoiled rotten. He just is. He's educated. He's adventurous. He's an explorer. That's one of the main characters. The other is Dr. Eileen Byrne. Now, Eileen Byrne, I have her fictionally as one of the first women to earn her PhD in archaeology from Oxford University. And she is a woman fighting against her times a bit. Same age as Dano. They grew up together as friends. She's Irish. He's British Romani. And I'm going to show you and by the way, in this story, she discovers an artifact, which is the whole catalyst of all the supernatural events going on in Egypt for these two characters. And I've kind of overtitled the book. It's called The 10 Breaths of Ra, which might change. And I've overtitled it with a banner that reads The Badcock and Burn Mysteries. And I've got them as occult detectives is what they become in this first novel. And this will carry on, hopefully, if all goes well, into more than one book in a series of books. But the first book takes place in 1920s Egypt, just prior to John Carter's discovery of King Tut's tomb. And I'm going to show you a little something here. This is, if you haven't seen this already, this is the cover to the book. And if you're listening on radio, sorry, you're not going to be able to see this unless you come on over to the YouTube channel. But here is the 10 Breaths of Ra cover. Let me find the right document. I didn't do this ahead of time. Sorry about that. So we'll see where it shows up here. It's in my list. I'm digging for it right now. It's in here. Hang on, because I want you to see the way these characters look. And I'm finding the right cover. There it is. Okay, it's only 72 DPI, so it's a little low res, but I think hopefully you'll enjoy this. There, whoa, it came in very big. So let me bring this back down. And as I mentioned, as it says right at the top of the front cover of the book, and I did this cover, by the way, because we were presenting it as an illustrated book with a, like a full color illustration per chapter kind of thing. There you go. That is the first cover, at least the concept for the 10 Breaths of Ra, and a Badcock and Burn adventure. And you see Dano in the front there, Dano Badcock, and behind him is Dr. Eileen Byrne, and behind them is the leader of the Egyptian black market that gets involved. And of course there's all these creatures and mummified baboon armies that are raised by a jinn as they're looking through all this research and looking for this artifact. And I'm going to read you the prologue to the book, and so you'll get an idea of what this is all about. And hopefully this will be something that will be fun to listen to. And I've given enough preamble now. We'll see if it hopefully does not take up the whole of the first hour, or first half hour. And here we go. I'm going to pull this up for you now. I want you to sit back, kind of get your visual, mental picture on. I'm going to leave that book cover up there as I read this. And here we go. This is how the book starts. The 10 Breaths of Ra, which a Badcock and Burn adventure. And I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survives stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck. Boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." That was a poem written by Percy Shelley. Now here is the prologue. Winter in the desert climes of Egypt could almost be considered pleasant. The blistering heat of the midday sun, reflecting off the rocks and sand, had the effect of creating an atmosphere that was nothing short of the inside of a cook oven. But during these milder months, the heat subsided to the comfort of an afternoon at the beach, and one might even find the need for a jumper and scarf to ward off the brisk, cool air between the swallowing and rebirth of Ra, the name the ancient Egyptians gave for the god of the sun. Donning her scarf, but leaving her woolly sweater draped over the canvas-backed chair at her desk, Dr. Eileen Byrne drew back the flap of the Bedouin tent given her by the local sheikh, a crafty yet gentlemanly old codger whose religion forbade him look on an infidel female, but who had the loving heart of a cherished old uncle. That air rushed in, smelled of campfire and goats and a mixture of spicy incense and pungent shisha. The woven doorway was portal to a world so unlike Eileen's native Ireland. A threshold to level sands stretching out as far as the eyes could see. The sun, a blazing pink ball, was just peeking over the crest of the distant low mountains, illuminating the sand dust with a pinkish gold haze that drew her mind to childhood stories of faraway realms and the Fae and their magical mists. Dr. Byrne, as the local workers called her, felt very lucky to have been asked to join this dig. Despite her years of education and study and subsequent years of field work while preparing her doctoral thesis, it was simply not done to have a young woman lead an archaeological expedition. She could only serve as an assistant, and were it not for the influence of her childhood friend Daniel Badcock, whose settled Romani family were formidable donors to the university, she may surely have been passed over simply for being a female. Cambridge professor Grantham Pike, the prickly mission director of the site, was a staunch old-world archaeologist who needed a bit of persuading by his colleagues before he officially accepted Eileen as his field assistant. While jubilantly grateful to the influence of her father and his friends, it rankled Eileen to the bone that she should not be appointed simply on her own merit. But she also understood the way things worked, and if she was ever to be accepted, she needed to show what she was made of. So she took it all with grace and indefatigable poise, deciding that her work here on the Giza Plateau would confirm her place amongst the archaeological gentry. Her drive was not egocentric, but rather the stuff of knowing who she was, what she was about, and striving to be the best. Truth be told, she was already all of those things, just a bit out of line with the accepted male-dominated status quo. Eileen was eager to launch into the day's work, and she rushed in giant confident strides across the archaeological compound, a patchwork of white canvas tents, littered with wheelbarrows, wooden tables, and all assortments of shovels, pickaxes, mukta headpans used to haul away debris by manual laborers, and sorted mounds of fakhar, the little shards of pottery found in every nook and cranny of every square foot of the desert flats around the Great Pyramid. She hoped to avoid Professor Pike's morning calisthenics, consisting of jumping jacks, push-ups, and running in place, and the daily singing of God Save the Queen, while the Union Jack was hoisted on a wooden pole, and slip out of camp and get directly to the site to continue her work on yesterday's mysterious discovery. So far so good. Pike was nowhere to be seen, but oddly, neither was anyone else. He was strangely quiet. Professor Pike was a man of great status at the university, but on site he was in some respects completely colonial. He issued orders from his open-air desk set on various carpets of fine Egyptian tapestry, while imbibing in tawny port from daybreak to sunset, which he, no doubt, obtained through his black market connections. He would sit in his high-back wood and leather throne, crystal goblet in one hand, while the other was always on a spread across some map or chart or hand-drawn facsimile of hieroglyphic or demotic inscriptions found on the tomb, and shrine walls dotting the rocky hills about them. He always dressed impeccably, the very picture of the adventurer explorer of bygone days. Jodhpurs and knee-high leather boots, a fine linen shirt and waistcoat, cravat at his throat, and a pith helmet atop his bald pate. His ever-present Egyptian punkawallas fanning him in the shade of a gigantic umbrella. Pike was, however, one of the most respected and celebrated archaeologists that came out of Cambridge, and he ruled his dig site with all the air and grandeur of a pharaoh of old. The quiet around Eileen was a bit offsetting. She slowed her pace and came to a full stop in the center of the camp. The silence was nearly deafening. There were no fires being stoked, no food being prepared, no carts being hauled, no sounds of workers singing, no chatter whatsoever. The air was still, and nothing seemed to give any indication that there was a huge archaeological city at the base of the Pyramid of Giza. With all the normal activity of the dig camp populated by several archaeologists and nearly 100 Egyptian workers, she had never noticed how quiet the desert could be. "Hello?" Eileen called out to the empty camp. "Is anyone here?" she said with a nervous chuckle rising in her throat. The response was more silence. Where had everybody gone? She strode over and stood before Professor Pike's desk, where his maps and papers were spread across the table. A goblet of the dark red port was tipped over, its contents pooled on the parchments. She reached out and set the goblet aright and again called out, "Professor Pike?" No answer. A slight wisp of breeze brisked up, lifting the corner of one of the charts that hung over the edge of the desk. She suddenly felt afraid and turned quickly to look toward the rocky hills in the distance. Why were they all gone? Had they left for the dig site before dawn and not sent word to wake her? She allowed a bit of anger to replace her fear, and she squared her shoulders and took off on a march in the direction of the dig. It was degrading enough not to be accepted on the same level as her male counterparts, but to be left behind when she was in the midst of deciphering a mysterious hieroglyph on an obscure wall of an even more obscure shrine tunneled out of the rock was more than she could tolerate. Would they ignore her discovery and take on the work and credit for themselves? Was this why she was left to wake up to an empty camp? All these questions flooded her mind in the passing of a heartbeat. She intended to find out what was going on and give Professor Pike a piece of her mind. Sure, it might get her a ticket on the next steamer leaving Alexandria, but she deserved more respect than this. As she cleared the last tent on the outer perimeter of the encampment, all her questions were immediately brought to a full stop. There, spread out on the sand before her, lying face down, were the Egyptian workers, all with their hands behind their heads, fingers interlaced. Circling the massive creatures stood at least 30 men, all similarly dressed in white galabeas and black vests, holding various weapons, from swords and daggers to rifles and pistols. Black face scarves covered all but their eyes, and a bright red fez sat atop each one's head. The scene looked almost like a photograph as no one moved or spoke. There at the front of the scene was Professor Pike, on his knees with 2 guards holding daggers to his throat, and another standing a few feet away with a British Enfield rifle pointed at his head. Seated between or behind the kneeling professor, lounging in Pike's throne, which had obviously been dragged there from behind his desk, was a very large, imposing man, dressed in similar fashion to the others. He wore no covering over his face, and his eyes reflected the rising sun as they shifted to look directly at her. Eileen's mouth dropped open. She tried to speak but could only croak out the word, "Professor?" In less time than it took her to get the word out of her mouth, the massive man who had been seated in the throne was standing up straight and tall, towering head and shoulders above the rest, his voice booming out one word that echoed across the sands and reverberated off rocky cliffs in the distance. "Silence!" Eileen froze. "Bring her to me," the large man ordered, to no one in particular. Immediately, 5 of the masked men ran toward Eileen, all shouting in Egyptian Arabic while brandishing their weapons, tripping over each other to see who could reach her first, wanting to impress their master. One of the 5, in very broken English, spat out while pushing down the head of one of his fellow minions. "You, come now, Yalabi, quick now!" The rest of the group started yelling out in unison, "Yalla, yalla, yalla!" spittle flying in all directions. Had the situation not been so grave, Eileen would have laughed at the bumbling, almost comedic actions of this band of criminals, the sum total of whose intelligent quotients could not have added up to a handful of date pits. And frankly, she found herself so repulsed by their ruffian manners and sensationally overwhelmed by their corporate god-awful stench, obviously acquired through countless months of bathing only when one tripped and fell into the rare mud puddle, that her befuddling attributes fell far short of provoking even a chuckle through her olfactory overloaded disdain. In fact, they were so repugnant in their dirty, oily, matted, damn near manged personification that it had the effect of rendering Eileen completely watery-eyed and distracted from any cogent thought of how to act or respond. This added to her fear. Having some grasp of the basic knowledge, she responded, "Yalla, yes, yalla, I will hurry." And as they reached her, they grabbed her by the arms, pulling her toward the large man standing behind Professor Pike. And also knowing something of the Egyptian customs, she yanked her arms away from her captors and said rather sternly, "La shukran! No, thank you. Do not touch me." She broke free of their hold, drew herself tall, raised her hand beneath her nose to ward off their scent, and walked calmly forward. One of the masked men had the grave misfortune of again grabbing her by the elbow, at which she spun around and slapped him across his face, tearing loose his black veil in a wide roundhouse swing. His face was grizzled and unshaven, and his eyes grew wide, less from the slap than the indignity he felt at being struck by a female in front of his peers. He gritted his rotting teeth and raised his fist to strike her. "Do not touch her, you foul scum!" yelled out Professor Pike, who was instantly slapped across the back of his head by one of the men holding him at knife point. Pike, feeling the fire of his once hardy youth, turned and spat at the feet of the attacker, who immediately lurched forward to impose some greater harm on the professor. At the same moment, Eileen yelled out in anger, "Stop, you animal!" speaking directly to the professor's attacker, but looking straight into the eyes of his leader, standing in front of Pike's throne. "Stop!" called out the leader of the captors. Less a shout and more a booming command. Instantly everyone froze. Then in a very quiet yet deep bassy tone, he said to Eileen, while motioning with his outstretched hand, "Come to me, please. We are not barbarians, young lady." He then looked to his minions and nodded, and they all lowered their arms. Taken aback by his sudden change in tone, yet still angry and afraid by what was happening around her, Eileen dropped her fighting posture, brushed her hands down the front of her shirt to smooth out her clothing, took a deep breath in and exhaled slowly through her lips, holding her head high, her nose a bit in the air. She slowly and precisely walked calmly through the scattered workers lying in the sand and stopped a few feet before Professor Pike. She looked down at him and asked softly, "Are you well, Professor?" And folks, that's where we have to end for this segment. We are at the end of, we're out of time for this segment. So we're going to come back. I didn't finish that reading in the first segment. We'll pick it up when we come back. And if we have time, we'll get on to the dream thing. And so sit tight. We'll be right back. All right, gang, we're back. Thanks for sitting on through the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid Radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. You can come on over to the simulcast and video on my YouTube channel and join the live chat room there at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Tonight, we're talking about dreams. We're talking about the mystical side of dreams, but we haven't gotten to that yet. I'm doing a little reading from the prologue of my new book that I am working on and attempting to finish soon, called The 10 Breaths of Ra. And if you missed it in the first segment, this is the cover of the book that I illustrated. And this is, I won't go through all the characters and all that again. You'll have to go back to the first part and listen to it in archive if you missed that. But we're in the midst of this, and I'm going to pick up the reading right where we left off. And we'll hopefully keep your attention, and it will be exciting for you to hear. All right, here we go. So now we just, I'll reread the the paragraph where I left off. Remember, it was the head of the, this big man of these captors of the archaeological group. And he yells out, "Stop!" called out the leader of the captors, less as a shout and more as a booming command. Instantly everyone froze. Then in a very quiet yet deep bassy tone he said to Eileen, while motioning with his outstretched hand, "Come to me, please. We are not barbarians, young lady." He then looked to his minions and nodded, and they all lowered their arms. Taken aback by his sudden change in tone, yet still angry and afraid by what was happening around her, Eileen dropped her fighting posture, brushed her hands down the front of her shirt to smooth out her clothing, took a deep breath in, and exhaled slowly through her lips, holding her head high, her nose a bit in the air, as she slowly and precisely walked calmly through the scattered workers lying in the sand, and stopped a few feet before Professor Pike. She looked down at him and asked softly, "Are you well, Professor?" "I am unharmed, my dear," he responded. Then to the guard who had slept in, "Were I a younger self, your face would be filled with my repeated double-fisted buffets, you fatherless son of a spotted goat." He cut off his threatening words and simply glared at the masked man, who turned away, angered by the insult, yet remaining obedient to his master's command. Ignoring Pike's comment, The leader spoke directly to Eileen. "Do you know who I am?" "I care little for who you are," Eileen retorted, finding her indignation somewhat greater than her fear. "For anyone who acts as you have acted, you are of as little significance to the greater world." Ignoring her intended derogatory, he answered, "I am Satesh. You may know me as the Jackal." "Ah," replied Eileen, "Satesh, the criminal. You and your band of befuddling fools here operate the black market in Egypt. I have nothing but diminutives to describe your lot. And Jackal, a self-appropriated title for a self-important crook." "How was your red port wine, Professor Pike?" the Jackal said, rather dismissively. "I do hope it was to your liking and pleasing to your palate." Pike, distracted by the thought of the tawny sweetness, mumbled, "Well, it was rather good. I wouldn't mind a wee nip now." His words trailed off. "Professor!" Eileen angrily interjected. "How can you, of all people, do business with—" and she looked straight into Satesh's eyes, this vermin." Satesh gripped the arms of Pike's throne in his massive hands, splintering the wood. Leaning forward in a defensive rejoinder, he spoke through grit teeth. "I have taken the head behind the mouth of many who have spoken much less than you, little fox. Your words are dung." He glared a fiery gaze into Eileen's eyes, burning through her haughty indignancy. "Speak to me no more in this tone, little fox," he hissed, slowly enunciating the words little and fox in staccato punctuation, as if holding them out as a derisive singularity. "Or we shall see how well you speak without a tongue in your pretty little mouth." He then sat back against the high-backed throne and exhaled, with his eyes closed. Eileen believed him, and in a blink of an eye, she became fully aware of how much deeper jeopardy she may have just placed on herself, Professor Pike, and their entire archaeological crew. "Forgive her, Jackal," Professor Pike blurted out in defense of his assistant. "She's an academic not accustomed with your ways, nor familiar with the power you possess in these lands. She is a child. She is a female. Forgive her." And after a pause he added, "Please?" At the very same moment, pandemonium broke out. One of Satesh's henchmen stepped out, his dagger held high above his head, eyes wide with a madness that stripped Eileen of all wit and sense. "You speak not at the Jackal in such, female!" He then lunged at her, screaming, "Allahu Akbar!" Satesh lurched to his feet, drawing his own dagger from the sash about his waist. His minions scrambled in confusion. Professor Pike bolted upright and threw himself at the screaming knife-wielder, sending him flailing to the ground. He kicked at the fallen man's head, then dove for the dagger he had dropped, which had fallen into the sand. As the mad minions screamed, Pike turned to face Satesh, only to be met with a flying dagger that plunged neatly and deeply into his chest. Satesh lowered his throwing arm, a deep scowl on his face, brows furrowing into his glowering, apoplectic eyes. Professor Pike stood motionless, save for a slow downward glance at the dagger protruding from his chest. He grasped for his breath, then dropped the dagger he held in his hand, shut his eyes, and slumped to the sand. Eileen, not usually given to overt screaming on any occasion, let out a shriek of pain and terror. Not accustomed to acknowledging the divine, she cried out in Gaelic, her native tongue, "Dians na na mine," and fell to her knees beside Pike. She cradled his head in her lap as he spat out blood with his last breath. Looking at Satesh, she said almost in a whisper, "What have you done?" Satesh stood perfectly still, glaring at Eileen. He then calmly sat back down in the throne, as if this was something he had done many times before. "Professor Pike was a good customer. Now I shall lose profits." Then, all strictly business, to his henchmen, he said, "Go to Pike's tent and gather up whatever cases of the red liquid remain. We can sell them in Cairo." Two of his men nodded and turned toward the camp to fulfill their master's command. Satesh leaned forward, addressing Eileen, as if they were the only two creatures in the world. "I will not be trifled with, little fox, and you will give me what I need, what Pike would not." Again Eileen believed him, but felt as if reality was slipping away from her. Who is this Satesh, and why did his presence here just shatter the world as she knew it? Why was he here? Why was she here? Just a few short minutes ago, she was watching Ra being born again, and now Professor Pike lay dead in her lap, his blood soaking into the sand beneath her. In a flash of bewilderment, Eileen asked, "What do you want from me?" "Because of you," Satesh replied, looking out to the rising sun. "Pike is dead, so you must now fulfill his purpose to me." "Because of me?" she asked, disgusted that something so heinous had just been said, yet pleading to understand the mad reasoning of this mad man. "In his drunk, he agreed to my wishes. In his sober, he refused. Now there is only you." "What," she beseeched, "is this savage riddle of yours?" "The inscription," he pointed to the hills in the distance. "You will give me its meaning." "But I don't know its meaning," Eileen replied in bewilderment. "Not yet." "You will give it to me, and you will give it to me the Chamber of Wisdom." "The what?" she asked in complete confusion. Satesh's eyes grew wide, and he leaned out even closer to Eileen. "Do not trifle with me." He then stood up abruptly and turned to face the hilly outcrop in the distance. "We go now. Bring her." A car engine ignited, coughed, and roared. Eileen was lurched off her knees and to her feet, the henchman grabbing her by her scarf, tearing it free from her neck. The awkward momentum threw her off balance, and she stumbled akimbo into the sand. Two other of Satesh's men immediately yanked her back to her feet and pushed her forward toward the idling, sputtering car. "Yalla! Yalla!" they all screamed at her. She had no thought to reply to the contrary, and was dragged to the waiting vehicle, with only half her footsteps actually touching the ground. Satesh was already seated in the rear of the open-top 1921 Grey Dort. He patted his huge hand on the open space next to him, smiling broadly, as if he was some loving relation stopping by to take her on a leisurely morning drive. Eileen stepped into the automobile and sat down next to the giant man, who nodded to the red-fezzed driver. The car immediately lurched forward, turning away from the encampment. Eileen fell back against the seat, her face turned away from Satesh. She looked back toward the receding tent city. Professor Pike lay still in the sand as Satesh's men, like a cloud of wasps, began following in the trail of the car. The camp workers, suddenly abandoned, were slowly standing to their feet, some of them moving toward the fallen professor as they grew smaller in the growing distance. Satesh shouted over the sounds of the engine, "We are on an adventure together!" He smiled, as if this was just another wonderful start to another beautiful day. The jackal tipped his head back and laughed, but not in some maniacal, twisted, horrific cackle Eileen imagined him using, but in a giddy, childlike chortle, like some street urchin taking his first ride on a merry-go-round. She took one last glance over her shoulder everything she had ever known up to this moment fading from view, obscured by the cloud of dust in the automobile's wake. And that, my friends, is the end of the prologue to The 10 Breaths of Ra. And that will be a book that I will hopefully finish before the end of summer and get into the hands of my agent. And so I hope you enjoyed that. That's the way the novel starts. Now it opens up in the next chapter on our other main character, Daniel Badcock, and him getting word about Eileen's kidnapping while he's back home living in the Castle Estate in England. And but we're not going to read that today. So there you go. I hope that was enjoyable. I hope it sets the stage and waters your mouth a bit for the adventure that lies ahead. And the story is rife with adventure, exploration, supernatural, mysticism, and all of these things all wrapped into one. With the mysticism of the Romani peoples, the Gypsy people, mixed into the mysticism of the Egyptian peoples, and ancient gods, ancient jinn, ancient mummified baboons, and other creatures of the night. And so, there it is. Hopefully it will set upon you, once you read it, with some dreams or possibly nightmares for the evenings ahead. So we've got about 11 or 12 minutes left in this program, and we haven't even touched on today's topic. So I'm going to hit on this and pick up a little bit where we left off talking about dreams. Let's get into dreams and the mystical side of dreams. And we're talking about dreams that there's far less to interpret in dreams when you look at spiritual dreams. How many of you had what you might think to be a spiritual dream? And what I mean by a spiritual dream is a dream that is giving you a message of something that you need to know for your life. Or how many of you have had contacts in a dream? We talked about that yesterday. How spirits or ghosts or the souls of our past loved ones have come to us in dreams. How many of you have had gods or a god or a deity of some sort speak to you in your dreams and give you directives? Probably a lot fewer of us. But if that's happened and you've determined that you're actually not insane, there is something to all of this. And far less effort is needed to interpret a spiritually based dream than I think is needed to interpret a regular old standard dream that comes out of your subconscious to process the day's activities. In fact, as a general rule, you could say that the greater the amount of spiritual content in your dream, the easier it is to interpret that dream. Why? Because the spiritual contents of dreams are not derived from our personal histories. They don't express purely egoic dilemmas. They're not out of our experience. They're outside of our experience, coming into us. They come from this transpersonal dimension of the psyche, and they're often composed of archetypical elements having universal significance. To interpret spiritual dreams, then, we need to understand what an archetype is, and this is kind of where we left off yesterday. In its broadest definition, an archetype is the original model. It's the pattern that gives a common form to objects that are instances, representations, or variations of an archetype. To give one concrete example, the Statue of Liberty in the harbor serves as a model or the archetype for all the little Statue of Liberty souvenirs that you can buy in the shops and souvenir stands all around the Statue of Liberty. I was once in business many years ago and bought one of those for my secretary back at the office, and as a souvenir. And this kind of archetype, I was told by my higher-ups there, always get souvenirs for your secretary when you're out of state. And so I traveled a lot as the creative director and working on my own personal story wrapped into this a little bit as the assistant to the CEO, and moved into events and planning and coordination. So I did a lot of travel. And everywhere I went, I would always pick up a little trinket to put on my secretary's desk. It let her know I was thinking of her, and it let her know that, you mean something to me on a business level. And this was right at the time, by the way, that my twins were born. So it was 28 years ago. But anyway, Statue of Liberty, souvenir. So this kind of archetype is easy to spot because it's a physical object, and it's serving as a model for other physical objects. And there are other kinds of non-physical archetypes, which are far more profound and mysterious. Consider, for instance, the natural numbers. If you were asked to describe the contents of your living room, you might begin by saying, well, there's one sofa, one table, 3 chairs, and in this example, one couch, one table, are both instances of the number 1 and 1. Similarly, the 3 chairs are an instance of the number 3 chairs. So what are the numbers themselves? You think they're the words 1, 2, 3? Consider that in Spanish, these are represented by the different words uno, dos, tres. And the same applies to arithmetic signs, 1, 2, 3, that we use to indicate numerals. And now these numbers could just as easily be represented by different signs. Say, for example, the Roman numerals, 1, 2, and 3. And thus, while we may see many physical instances and representations of natural numbers, the numbers themselves never manifest as a physical object in time and space. For instance, when I had my dream of being in the concentration camp the other night, I had to look at how many guards were there. I only saw 2. Was that significant? Was that a number 2? When I was having the dream of the contact from my aunt who had passed away, there was 1 phone. Did that mean anything? There were 0 people other than me in the room. Did that mean anything? So, along with other primordial ideas or names, conceptual archetypes exist only in an unmanifest realm known variously in the great traditions as the mind of God in the Christian, the treasures of Allah in Muslim, the granary of 10,000 things in Taoism, and the Paravak in Hindu, and the ground Alaya in the Buddhist way of thinking. So even more mysterious, at least to us in the modern West, than conceptual archetypes are what we might call these psycho-spiritual archetypes, which help shape the behavior and the destinies of all human beings. And so these are manifested in the pantheons of gods and goddesses, heroes and ancestors, spirits, angels, and who, according to all spiritual traditions, inhabit incorporeal realms of the cosmos, and while whose deeds are recounted in the myths and legends of every culture, they appear to us in our dreams, if it's a spiritually based dream. Now, at first glance, the manifestations of the psycho-spiritual archetypes found in one culture might appear to be quite different from those found in another. But comparative studies by psychologists such as Carl Jung, Marie-Louise von Franz, and by scholars like Marcia Eliade and Joseph Campbell have demonstrated, despite their local variations, these archetypical manifestations perform the same symbolic functions, and their stories express the same dramatic themes in all cultures. Especially relevant for our present discussion is a remarkable discovery made by Carl Jung, that these archetypes that we see in our dreams, they appear spontaneously in the dreams of all sorts of people, even those who've never been exposed to them in waking life. To account for these phenomena, Jung posited the existence of a collective unconscious shared by all human beings, a pool in which we all dip our feet, so to speak, the shared collective consciousness, which can be accessed in certain visionary or dream states by any individual, irrespective of his or her cultural background. So we can glean something of what Jung was talking about by making a brief cross-cultural comparison of our own. For instance, and I have a hard time with this name, even though I've practiced it many times, Injurgargyuk, a caribou Eskimo, probably sound like Ingargyuk. There you go. He gives this account of what happened to him at the end of a vision quest. He said, "Only toward the end of the 30 days did a helping spirit come to me, a lovely and beautiful healing spirit whom I never thought of. It was a white woman. She came to me whilst I had collapsed, exhausted, and was sleeping, but I still saw her lifelike hovering over me. She came to me from Pinga, a goddess, and was a sign that Pinga had now noticed me and would give me powers that would make me a shaman." Similarly, during a dark retreat undertaken when he was still a young man, the famous Tibetan master Longchen Pa had a vision of a beautiful woman riding a horse who gave him a crown of precious jewels and told him, "From now on, I shall always bestow my blessings upon you and grant you powers." And here's the last part of a dream that this author that wrote about Ingukjaguk had long before he ever heard of him or of Longchen Pa. He said, "With great difficulty I struggle on toward the top of the mountain, and at last I make it. I look out over a breathtaking landscape spread at my feet. The 7 continents and 7 seas extended before my eyes to a 360-degree horizon. Both the sun and moon are simultaneously visible in the sky, one half of which is night, the other day, and a sacred hush envelops the world. Suddenly, I become aware of a woman standing at my side, wearing a helmet. She hands me a sword and says, 'This sword is as bright as the moon and as sharp as the stars, and with it you can cut through the heart of truth.' I take the sword and hold it in the palm of my hand, and it feels powerful and good. Then I turn to the woman and ask, 'Who are you?' 'Don't you know?' she laughs gently. 'I am Athena, and I've been with you always.'" In those examples I just read you, we can see clearly that it's the same archetype, the feminine guide, appeared to each one of them, to give her a generic title, the feminine guide, who manifests to empower and encourage these spiritual seekers living in very different times and places. But while Jung's pioneering work has been key to our modern understanding of archetypes, it nevertheless falls short in one crucial respect, at least as far as mystics are concerned. Jung believed that becoming conscious of archetypical influences helps human beings evolve toward the highest goal of life, which in his view was individuation, word we've used before, becoming a whole and self-actualized individual. And this process of psychic integration is driven by what he thought of as a greater self, the total psyche, including its unconscious dimensions. In the mystic's view, however, the highest goal in life is not any sort of individuation process. On the contrary, it's the attainment of realization, of gnosis, knowledge, of enlightenment of one's identity with that ground of all being, ground being capitalized, ground of all being, which is called variously God, Brahman, Buddha nature, the Tao, or as we would say, consciousness itself. And there's a lot more, but we got to end there. I read my part of my book to you, and I had fun doing that. It's Friday. We're going to pick this up on Monday and talk about dreams and the mystical element in dreams when we come back on Monday with this show. Sunday morning, 9 a.m. Central Standard Time for It's Sunday live broadcast, not part of the Odyssey radio program, but my own live broadcast here on my YouTube stream. Be there 9 a.m. Central. That's 10 Eastern, that's 7 on Left Coast time. Thanks for being here tonight and all this week. We'll talk again soon. Have a good night.